Poor people shouldn't try to act rich, Vanessa said with a laugh, and the room joined her before I even had a chance to set down my coffee cup. The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. Somehow they cut deeper because they were wrapped in smiles, champagne glasses, and polite conversation. I sat quietly at the bridal boutique in downtown Chicago, surrounded by ivory fabrics, crystal chandeliers, and people who seemed determined to remind me that I didn't belong there. My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I was 69 years old, a widow, and according to my future daughter-in-law, the poorest person in the room. The irony almost made me smile. Vanessa stood in front of a 3-panel mirror wearing a designer wedding gown that cost more than my first car. She turned from side to side while her friends admired every detail. My son Ryan stood nearby with his hands in his pockets, watching her with the same expression he always wore around her. Admiration. Obedience. Maybe even fear. "This dress is perfect," one of Vanessa's friends said. "Well, it should be," Vanessa replied. "Someone has to make this wedding look expensive." Then she glanced directly at me. "No offense, Eleanor." The women laughed again. I noticed Ryan smile awkwardly before looking away. Not once did he defend me. Not once did he tell her to stop. I lowered my eyes to my paper cup and pretended to focus on the cooling coffee inside. Years ago, that silence would have broken my heart. Now it simply confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. People reveal themselves when they think they have power. The wedding was only 6 weeks away. Every conversation revolved around money. The venue. The flowers. The catering. The musicians. Vanessa wanted everything larger, brighter, and more expensive than the last plan. Every week she found a new reason to increase the budget. Every week Ryan agreed. Neither of them seemed concerned about where the money came from. They simply assumed it would appear. As if it always had. Vanessa stepped down from the platform and adjusted the skirt of her dress. "Honestly," she said, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I'm just grateful Ryan didn't inherit his mother's financial situation." More laughter followed. I felt dozens of eyes shift toward me. Waiting. Watching. Hoping for a reaction. I gave them none. I simply smiled and took another sip of coffee. Let them believe whatever they wanted. Let them think I was embarrassed. Let them think I was weak. Let them think I was exactly who Vanessa described. Sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is remain silent, while everyone else writes the wrong story about them. An hour later, as the appointment ended, Vanessa walked past me and patted my shoulder. "Don't worry," she said sweetly. "When Ryan and I are married, we'll make sure you're taken care of." I looked into her eyes and saw something hidden beneath the kindness. Calculation. Confidence. Certainty. She truly believed she had already won. As I watched her leave the boutique, surrounded by friends and expensive shopping bags, I realized something important. They weren't laughing because they thought I was poor. They were laughing because they thought they knew everything about me. And that was going to be the most expensive mistake of their lives. The drive home took nearly 40 minutes, but I barely noticed the traffic. The late afternoon sun stretched across the highway, turning the windows of office buildings into sheets of gold. Vanessa would have loved that image. She always admired things that looked expensive. Appearances mattered to her more than substance. I parked in front of my small brick house just before 6 o'clock. The paint on the shutters was beginning to fade. The porch swing creaked when the wind blew. To most people, it looked like the home of a retired widow living on a fixed income. That was exactly what I wanted them to see. I carried my purse inside and placed it on the kitchen counter. The house was quiet. Peacefully quiet. No wedding planners calling. No vendors demanding upgrades. No conversations about luxury centerpieces that cost more than some people paid for a month of groceries. Just silence. I poured myself a glass of iced tea and sat by the window overlooking my backyard. The oak tree my husband planted 25 years earlier still stood in the same spot. Strong. Unmoved. Reliable. Unlike most of the people in my life these days, my late husband, Charles, used to say that money revealed character more than it created it. At the time I thought he was being cynical. Now I understood exactly what he meant. For months I had watched subtle changes in Ryan. Small things at first. He stopped asking how I was doing and started asking whether I had updated my estate documents. He stopped visiting for Sunday dinners and started calling whenever a financial decision appeared on the horizon. Every conversation somehow drifted toward assets, property values, investments, or future plans. First, I blamed Vanessa. It was easier that way. Easier to believe my son was being influenced rather than making his own choices. But excuses become harder to maintain when the pattern repeats itself over and over again. 3 days after the bridal appointment, Ryan called while I was trimming roses near the fence. His voice sounded cheerful. Too cheerful. Mom, Vanessa found another venue option. It is a little more expensive, but it would really make the day special. I smiled to myself. Another increase. Another request. Another test. How much more expensive? I asked. There was a brief pause. About $30,000. I looked down at the gardening gloves covering my hands. $30,000. He said it the way someone might mention the cost of a dinner reservation. That is certainly a lot of money, I replied. Well, Ryan laughed nervously, you always find a way to make things work. There it was. Not gratitude. Expectation. The conversation ended a few minutes later, but the words stayed with me. You always find a way. Neither Ryan nor Vanessa ever asked whether I wanted to pay for these things. They simply assumed I would. Later that evening, I opened a drawer in my study and removed a thick folder. Inside were years of documents, notes, letters, and records. Information most people never knew existed. I slowly turned the pages while the grandfather clock in the hallway ticked through the silence. Outside, the sun disappeared below the horizon. Inside, something else was becoming clear. Vanessa believed. She understood me because she had measured me by my clothes, my car, and my modest home. Ryan believed he understood me because I had spent a lifetime protecting him from difficult truths. Neither of them had ever bothered to look deeper. As I closed the folder and returned it to the drawer, I realized that their confidence was growing. They were becoming careless. And careless people eventually reveal far more than they intend. The opportunity arrived sooner than I expected. 4 days later, Vanessa invited several friends to a private dinner at a new restaurant overlooking Lake Michigan. Ryan called that morning and suggested I join them. His enthusiasm sounded forced, which immediately made me suspicious. Still, I accepted. By 6:30 that evening, I was seated at the far end of a long table surrounded by polished glass, soft lighting, and conversations that revolved around vacations, luxury homes, and designer labels. Vanessa seemed especially cheerful. She wore a white blazer that probably cost more than my monthly utility bills, and spent most of the evening making sure everyone noticed it. I listened quietly while the group discussed wedding plans. Every few minutes someone mentioned another expensive addition. A larger floral display. Imported desserts. A live orchestra. Each suggestion was met with excitement. Then came the conversation that changed everything. Vanessa excused herself to take a phone call. A few minutes later, 2 of her closest friends followed her toward the outdoor terrace. I remained at the table for a while before deciding to step outside for fresh air. The evening breeze coming off the lake felt cool against my skin. As I rounded the corner near the terrace entrance, I heard Vanessa laughing. Instinctively, I stopped. Once we are married, everything becomes much easier, she said. Ryan still thinks his mother controls everything. But honestly, she is living in the past. One of the women laughed. What if she refuses to help financially anymore? Vanessa sounded completely unconcerned. Then Ryan will convince her. He always does. Besides, eventually the estate becomes his anyway. Another voice asked, and what about the house? Vanessa lowered her voice slightly, but I still heard every word. We already talked about that. It is far too large for one older woman. Eventually she will move somewhere smaller. Ryan agrees. For a moment nobody spoke. I stood perfectly still behind the stone column separating the terrace from the hallway. The lake shimmered beneath the city lights. Somewhere in the distance a boat horn echoed across the water. Yet all I could focus on were those few sentences. Not because they surprised me, because they confirmed what I had suspected for months. Vanessa was not planning a future with me in it. She was planning a future built on what she believed would someday belong to her. The conversation continued. They joked about retirement communities. They joked about inheritance. They joked about how little I understood. Each laugh revealed another layer of arrogance. Eventually, I returned to the dining room before anyone noticed my absence. My expression never changed. My hands remained steady. When Vanessa returned a few minutes later, she smiled warmly and asked whether I was enjoying dinner. Very much, I replied. And for the first time all evening, that answer was completely honest. Because now I finally knew exactly what game was being played. The rest of the evening passed quietly. Ryan talked about honeymoon destinations. Vanessa discussed flower arrangements. Their friends offered opinions. I simply listened, observed, collected details. By the time I drove home that night, the city skyline had disappeared behind me and the roads were nearly empty. The truth had finally stepped out of the shadows. They thought they were planning their future. What they did not realize was that every careless word had just changed mine. The following morning, I called the one person who had known my family longer than anyone else still alive. Michael Hayes answered on the second ring. His voice sounded exactly as it had 20 years earlier. Calm, precise, impossible to surprise. He had been Charles's attorney before he became mine. More importantly, he was one of the few people who knew the full truth. We agreed to meet that afternoon at his office overlooking the Chicago River. Rain tapped softly against the windows when I arrived. Michael greeted me with a firm handshake and led me into a private conference room. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with legal volumes that had probably not moved in decades. I sat across from him and explained everything. The bridal appointment, the restaurant conversation, the assumptions Ryan and Vanessa were making about my future. Michael listened without interrupting. When I finished, he folded his hands and stared thoughtfully at the table. I was wondering how long it would take, he finally said. How long what would take? I asked. How long before they showed their intentions openly? His answer did not surprise me. Michael opened a drawer and removed several folders. They looked familiar. I had seen some of them years earlier after Charles passed away. Others were newer. Much newer. He carefully arranged them across the table. Ryan contacted me 6 months ago, he said. I felt my stomach tighten slightly. About what? Michael opened one folder. He wanted information regarding future distributions, trust structures, and inheritance timelines. I remained silent. 3 months later, Vanessa requested a meeting. She claimed she was helping Ryan organize family finances. Michael paused briefly. The questions were remarkably specific. I already knew what that meant. She had not been interested in understanding finances. She had been trying to locate them. Michael slid another document toward me. They never gained access to anything important, but they certainly tried to understand where everything was. I stared at the papers. Years ago, after Charles died unexpectedly, I had followed his instructions exactly. Most of our holdings were placed inside structures designed for long-term protection. Public records revealed almost nothing. Ownership was layered carefully, deliberately. To anyone looking from the outside, I appeared comfortable but ordinary. That illusion had served me well for many years. Apparently it had also fooled my own family. Do they know the actual size? I asked quietly. Michael almost laughed. Not even close. The room fell silent. Rain continued tapping against the glass. Somewhere outside, a siren echoed through the city before fading into the distance. For the first time in weeks, I felt something unexpected. Not anger. Clarity. Every conversation suddenly made sense. Every wedding upgrade. Every financial request. Every patronizing comment. They had constructed an entire future based on assumptions. Assumptions that were completely wrong. Michael leaned back in his chair. What do you want to do? Most people would have answered immediately. I did not. Instead, I looked out at the river flowing between the buildings below. Steady, patient, unhurried. Then I smiled. Nothing yet, I said. Michael nodded as if he had expected that answer all along. Because sometimes the strongest move is not exposing the truth immediately. Sometimes it is allowing people enough time to reveal exactly who they are before the truth finally arrives. Over the next 2 weeks, I became exactly the person Vanessa expected me to be. I never questioned a single wedding expense. When she wanted upgraded floral arrangements, I approved them. When she decided the reception needed custom imported decorations, I approved those too. Every request was met with the same calm smile. The more agreeable I became, the more confident she grew. Confidence has a strange effect on people. It makes them careless. Ryan stopped pretending the wedding budget mattered. During one phone call, he casually mentioned an additional $20,000 as if he were discussing the weather. Another evening, he stopped by my house carrying venue brochures and spent nearly an hour explaining why a more luxurious ballroom would be worth the extra cost. Not once did he ask whether I was comfortable paying for it. Not once did he express gratitude. He simply assumed the answer would always be yes. I listened patiently and poured him coffee while he talked. Across the table sat the same little boy I had once taught to ride a bicycle. Yet somehow he felt like a stranger. A few days later, Vanessa invited me to lunch at an upscale restaurant near the Magnificent Mile. The dining room overlooked the city, and sunlight reflected off the surrounding glass towers. She arrived 20 minutes late, and immediately launched into another discussion about wedding upgrades. Crystal centerpieces, specialty lighting, designer invitations. I watched her speak with endless enthusiasm. Finally, she paused long enough to take a sip of sparkling water. "You have been incredibly generous," she said. The compliment sounded rehearsed. "I just want everything to be perfect," I replied. Vanessa smiled. "That is why Ryan and I always say we can count on you." The wording caught my attention. Count on you. Not love you. Not appreciate you. Count on you. As though I were a resource rather than a person. Later that afternoon, after returning home, I found a large envelope in my mailbox. Inside were copies of documents Michael had promised to send. Records of inquiries. Meeting notes. Formal requests for information. Nothing illegal. Nothing dramatic. But together they painted a remarkably clear picture. Ryan and Vanessa had spent months trying to understand assets they believed would eventually become theirs. The papers confirmed what I already knew. Their wedding was not simply a celebration. In their minds, it was the beginning of a transfer of power. They believed they were stepping into a future already secured for them. That evening I sat alone on my back porch watching the sunset sink behind the oak tree. The air smelled faintly of freshly cut grass. A neighbor's sprinkler clicked rhythmically in the distance. Everything felt peaceful, almost ordinary. Yet beneath that quiet surface, an important decision had already been made. I would continue paying for every detail they requested. I would continue smiling. I would continue allowing them to underestimate me. Because the closer the wedding came, the more certain they became that they had everything under control. And certainty, when built on false assumptions, has a way of collapsing at exactly the wrong moment. 3 weeks remained before the ceremony when Michael called and asked whether I could meet him again. His tone was calm, but I recognized the subtle difference immediately. Something had happened. The next afternoon I arrived at his office carrying a notebook and a growing sense of curiosity. He closed the conference room door behind us and placed a thin folder on the table. "You were right to wait," he said. I opened the folder and found copies of recent correspondence. Several emails. A few meeting summaries. Notes from financial inquiries. Nothing dramatic on its own. Yet together they revealed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Vanessa had become increasingly aggressive in her attempts to gather information. She had contacted professionals connected to the family. She had asked indirect questions about trusts, ownership structures, and future transfers. Most people would have considered the questions harmless. Michael and I knew better. "She is getting impatient," I said. Michael nodded. "And impatience leads to mistakes." He turned one page toward me. Particular email caught my attention. Vanessa had written that she wanted to better understand what would eventually become available to Ryan after certain future events. The wording was careful, polite, professional, yet the meaning beneath it was unmistakable. She was already counting assets that did not belong to her. On the drive home, I found myself thinking less about Vanessa and more about Ryan. That was the painful part. Vanessa had entered our lives as an outsider. Ryan had not. I remembered helping him with science projects at the kitchen table. I remembered baseball games, school concerts, college graduation. I remembered the young man who once thanked a waiter for bringing an extra napkin. Somewhere along the way, ambition and entitlement had quietly replaced gratitude. That evening Ryan called. "Mom, great news," he said. "The final venue upgrade was approved." I smiled despite the fact that he could not see me. "That sounds exciting." "It really is. Everyone says it is going to be unforgettable." Unforgettable. The word lingered in my mind long after the conversation ended. The next few days brought more requests. Additional decorations. Premium transportation. Expanded guest accommodations. I approved every single one. Vanessa even sent me a message thanking me for being so supportive. Reading it felt almost surreal. She believed she was managing the situation perfectly. She believed every door was opening exactly as planned. Meanwhile, Michael continued gathering information quietly. Every new document revealed another assumption. Every assumption revealed another weakness. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sky darken above the oak tree, my phone buzzed with a message from Vanessa. Attached was a photograph of the wedding seating chart. My name had been placed near the back of the reception hall, far from the head table, far from the spotlight. I stared at the image for several seconds before setting the phone down beside me. Then I laughed softly. Not because it hurt, because it confirmed everything. They were no longer pretending. In their minds, my role had already been reduced to a checkbook and a signature. They believed the future belonged to them. What they did not understand was that the future they were planning existed only in their imagination. The morning of the ceremony arrived with clear skies and the kind of perfect weather wedding planners dream about for months. By 8 o'clock, the hotel ballroom was already buzzing with activity. Florists carried arrangements through the lobby. Event staff adjusted tables and lighting. Guests began arriving from different parts of the country, dressed in their finest clothes and eager to celebrate what everyone believed would be the beginning of a beautiful future. I arrived shortly before 10. The venue overlooked Lake Michigan, and sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, making the entire room glow. Everything looked flawless. Every flower was in place. Every chair perfectly aligned. Every expensive detail exactly as Vanessa had envisioned. As I walked through the entrance, several guests greeted me warmly. Many of them assumed I must be proud. Some thanked me for helping create such a magnificent event. I smiled politely and accepted their compliments. Across the room, Vanessa stood surrounded by bridesmaids, photographers, and wedding coordinators. She looked delighted, confident, victorious. When she spotted me, she crossed the room with a bright smile. "Eleanor, everything looks amazing," she said. "I knew we could count on you." There was that phrase again. Count on you. I simply nodded. "I am glad everything turned out the way you wanted." She seemed pleased by the answer and quickly returned to her circle of admirers. A few minutes later, Ryan joined me near the windows overlooking the water. For a brief moment I studied his face. He looked happy, relaxed, certain of what came next. "Mom," he said, "I wanted to thank you for everything. None of this would have happened without your support." The words sounded sincere. Unfortunately, sincerity arrives too late when understanding never comes with it. "You are welcome," I replied. He smiled and glanced around the ballroom. "Can you believe it is finally here?" I followed his gaze across the room. The chandeliers sparkled above hundreds of guests. Servers prepared champagne trays. Musicians tuned their instruments near the stage. Months of planning had led to this exact moment. "Yes," I said quietly. "It is finally here." By noon, the guest list was nearly complete. Friends, relatives, business associates, and neighbors filled the venue with conversation and laughter. Yet beneath all the excitement, I noticed something else. Vanessa and Ryan kept moving through the crowd like people already celebrating a victory. Their confidence had become absolute. They no longer hid their assumptions. They no longer questioned the future they had imagined. In their minds, every piece was already in place. Shortly before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, my phone vibrated. A simple message appeared on the screen. It was from Michael. 3 words. "Everything is ready." I looked toward the entrance at the far end of the ballroom. Staff members continued preparing for the procession. Guests took their seats. Conversations softened. Anticipation filled the room. Around me, everyone believed they knew exactly how the day would unfold. I slipped my phone back into my purse and calmly took my seat. For the first time in months, I felt completely at peace. Because in just a little while, The only thing arriving before the vows would be the truth. The music was about to begin when Michael entered through the main ballroom doors. He was not dressed like a guest. He carried a slim leather portfolio under one arm and walked with the calm confidence of a man who had spent decades delivering uncomfortable truths. At first, almost nobody noticed him. Conversations continued. Guests adjusted their seats. Photographers prepared their cameras. Then Michael approached the front of the room and quietly spoke with the event manager. Within seconds, the manager's expression changed. A ripple of confusion moved through the staff. Vanessa noticed it first. Her smile faded slightly as she watched the exchange. Ryan followed her gaze. I remained seated. The room gradually grew quiet. Michael stepped toward the center aisle and addressed the gathering in a measured voice. Ladies and gentlemen, before this ceremony proceeds, there are several important matters that require clarification. A murmur spread through the crowd. Vanessa immediately walked forward. What is this? She asked, forcing a nervous laugh. We are about to start. Michael opened his portfolio. This event has been funded under agreements that were established in good faith. Recent information has demonstrated that those conditions no longer exist. The ballroom fell silent. Vanessa looked toward Ryan. Ryan looked toward me. Neither seemed to understand what was happening. Michael continued. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse anyone dramatically. He simply presented facts. Records of repeated attempts to obtain private financial information. Documentation of inquiries regarding assets that did not belong to either of them. Communications revealing plans built entirely around expected access to future wealth. One by one, the assumptions they had hidden behind smiles were exposed to daylight. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Several people exchanged surprised glances. Vanessa's confidence began slipping away. This is ridiculous, she said. You are twisting everything. Michael calmly handed copies of the documents to several individuals seated near the front. The evidence spoke for itself. Nobody needed a speech. Nobody needed an argument. The truth was sitting on paper in plain black ink. Then Michael stepped aside. For the first time all afternoon, every eye in the ballroom turned toward me. I rose slowly from my chair. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. Ryan stared at me with confusion. Vanessa stared at me with disbelief. I spent months listening, I said quietly. I listened when people assumed they knew my worth. I listened when they discussed my future without including me. I listened when gratitude disappeared and entitlement took its place. Nobody interrupted. The wedding expenses, the upgrades, the endless requests. I approved all of them because I wanted to understand exactly what mattered most. I paused briefly. Now I do. Vanessa opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Ryan looked pale. Lost. As if the future he had imagined was slipping away faster than he could comprehend. I reached into my purse and removed a single folder. Inside was a notice terminating every remaining financial commitment connected to the event. Venue payments. Vendor agreements. Outstanding balances. Everything. Already processed. Already finalized. Effective immediately, I said. My support ends here. The silence that followed felt enormous. Around us stood thousands of flowers, expensive decorations, and months of planning. Yet in that moment none of it mattered. Because the illusion they had built their future upon had finally disappeared. For several seconds nobody moved. The ballroom that had been filled with excitement only moments earlier now felt frozen in place. Guests sat quietly, absorbing what they had just witnessed. Some looked shocked. Others looked embarrassed. A few simply stared at the floor. Ryan remained standing near the front of the room, his expression caught somewhere between confusion and regret. Vanessa looked around as if searching for someone who could somehow restore the version of reality she had expected. Nobody came to her rescue. Nobody challenged the documents. Nobody questioned the facts. Because there was nothing left to debate. The truth had already done its work. I gathered my purse and prepared to leave. As I turned toward the aisle, Ryan finally spoke. Mom, wait. His voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. I stopped but did not turn around immediately. Please, he continued. Can we talk? Slowly I faced him. The room watched in complete silence. I could see years of assumptions collapsing behind his eyes. For the first time in a very long time, he was not speaking as a future heir. He was speaking as a son who suddenly realized he no longer understood his mother. "There is nothing left to explain today," I said gently. "The choices that brought us here were not made in a single afternoon. They were made over months, maybe even years." Ryan lowered his eyes. Vanessa remained silent. I noticed that her confidence had disappeared completely. The certainty she had carried for so long was gone. In its place stood someone confronting consequences she never imagined possible. Michael stepped beside me and handed me one final folder. Inside were the completed revisions to my estate plans. Months earlier, I had already begun making changes. That process was now finished. The majority of the family wealth would be directed toward charitable foundations, educational scholarships, and community programs that Charles and I had supported for years. The purpose of wealth, he often said, was not to create entitlement. It was to create opportunity. As I looked across the ballroom, I realized how right he had been. Money had never been the real issue. Character was. The following weeks were surprisingly peaceful. The wedding did not move forward. Guests returned home. Conversations faded. Life continued. Ryan called several times. At first, I was not ready to answer. Eventually, I did. The conversations were difficult, honest, necessary. Trust is not rebuilt in a day. Sometimes it takes much longer than people expect. But at least we were finally speaking truthfully. One afternoon, months later, I sat on my porch beneath the oak tree and watched the sunlight move across the yard. The air was warm. The neighborhood was quiet. For the first time in years, I felt completely at peace. Not because I had won, not because someone else had lost, but because I had stopped allowing other people to define my worth. They looked at my modest house, my simple clothes, and my quiet life and assumed they understood who I was. They measured wealth in appearances. They measured value in access. They were wrong. The greatest fortune I possessed was never sitting in a bank account. It was the ability to walk away from disrespect without losing myself in the process. And as the evening sun settled behind the trees, I realized something that made me smile. The poorest person in that ballroom had never been me.